Thank you. Welcome. This is the 6th of our 7-part lecture series on the spirit of enterprise, the businesses that shaped or were shaped by the town of Hingham. And when we started the idea, which my dear friend Elizabeth Danis, our board member, will speak to you in a minute, we thought about some very old companies, and then we thought about, well, who's still in business? And we, as many of you know, we did a program on Talbots, and we thought, well, what other companies have been around for 70 years? And the Sub Galley has been around for 70 years. But then we remembered MASSA on Lincoln Street. So we're thrilled for you to join us today to learn more about what do they do in that building. But before I get into that, I did want to again welcome you all to the Hingham Heritage Museum. For those who are visiting us for the first time, you'll see that this beautiful 200-year-old building looks fabulous because we reopened in 2017 after a multi-year renovation to make the building accessible to all, climate controlled, and a better use of space so we can do fun programs like today's lecture and inaugural exhibit opening with MASSA products. For those of you who receive mail in Hingham, for the first time in our history, we have sent out this fabulous membership brochure in full color. And we welcome you to join us because as a member-supported nonprofit, that's the only way we keep the lights on. So I'd like to introduce you to Elizabeth Danis, board member and chair of our education committee.
Thank you, Deidre. As Deidre said, welcome. We're glad you could join us today. I want to introduce our two speakers today. First of all, Don Massa is second generation of MASSA. He is both an engineer and a businessman. He is also the co-founder of MASSA Products Corporation in its present configuration. He has a master's degree in electrical engineering from Northeastern University and served on their board of trustees for a decade. He is recognized as a leader in the field of electroacoustics and was trained by Frank Massa, his father, who is also known as the father of modern sonar transducers. He has written many papers and has been awarded numerous patents, but most importantly, he has developed hundreds of designs that have led to production and has advanced the business. Although most of MASSA's business is in B2B, not sure what that is, but I bet I know when we finish today, and military products, a notable invention of Don's that most people would recognize is the automatic bowling scoring system, and that I do know about. MASSA manufactured and sold this business to AMF for over a decade. He has also followed in his father's footsteps to advance the field of electroacoustics and has expanded the company beyond transducer design and fabrication to include the innovation and production of electroacoustics electronic systems. He presently serves as president and CTO of MASSA Products Corporation and holds a seat as chairman of the board. Now, Dawn is third generation at MASSA. Her talents are in business strategy, and she serves to develop the business both internally and externally. She is responsible for increasing the amount of new product sales at MASSA and getting customers and partners alike to be proud to sport the MASSA Sonic brand for co-branded developments. She is a published writer and artist and holds a master's degree in psychology with a focus on systems dynamics and a certificate in finance, and is also a mother of two wonderful boys who are here today. She is in charge of all new product development, innovation, marketing, and is the liaison between the needs of the industrial consumer world and the technical compatibilities of MASSA. Dawn is also responsible for preserving and sharing the family values, traditions, cultures, and recipes at the company and with her own family. She is both the Chief Innovative Officer and the Chief Operating Officer for MASSA Corporation and holds a seat on the board of directors. Both Don and Dawn are actively involved with the South Shore Conservatory. Both of them are on the governance committee. Don is a trustee, Dawn is an overseer, and also on the Overseer Council. MASSA Products Corporation is a business partner of both the Hingham Historical Society and the South Shore Conservatory. Join me in welcoming Don and Dawn.
So our most common question when people drive by or find out where we work is, oh, MASSA, what do you do in there? So we figured this is our main opportunity to share a little bit about that with you. So our story, being that we're a third generation family business here in America, starts a ways back, and it goes beyond MASSA. So it's the story of my grandfather, it's the story of my father, and it's the story of myself, as well as all the people that have worked with us through the ages. But Frank's story, my grandfather, it's really the classic American dream. So he was born Francesco Enrico Antonio Massa in Boston's North End, April 10th, 1906. And if you just take a moment to think about 1906, Boston for an Italian family, it was a very different world than what it is today. So that just get your mind around that as we continue. Frank was the oldest of 8 children. It was him, Frank, Ernie, Henrietta, Olga, Gilda, Grace, Aida, and Anthony. And because it was very important to our family to be successful in America at that time, English was the language that was favored. However, Italian cooking kind of stays favored by the family in the kitchen to this day. So it's interesting to me, the culture was you do what you need to do to get ahead in an honest, hardworking way, but the culture is still there, even though we said, you know what, it's not to our advantage to speak Italian. We're going to learn English. So sadly, I don't speak Italian fluently. Yeah, of course you can. He wants to talk.
I think it's important to understand, too, some of the struggles that occurred when my grandmother came over from Italy to Boston with an arranged marriage with my grandfather in Boston. They didn't meet until she got off the boat, and then they married. She didn't speak English at all. He was an American citizen and spoke English and Italian. My father was born 9 months later. My grandmother hadn't learned English yet. So they could only speak in the house when my father was growing up, very young, in Italian. So his native language was Italian. When he started school in the first grade, he couldn't speak English. His grandfather went to school with him to help translate, and he had to sit through school classes in English when he could only speak Italian. But young kids very quickly can master different languages, so he quickly learned English. My grandfather didn't have to spend too much time there. And that's part of the reason why he was pushing English, because he wanted to fit in. He wanted to be an American. So that's why we never learned Italian.
Right, we never learned Italian. But we're fluent in food. But to that point, it wasn't just grandfather that wanted to fit in. It was the family's value.
yeah,
and it was, this is the American immigrant story at that time. So his grandmother at the same time knew how important it was to get ahead, you need an education. So that was like a prominent value. So she was saving a jar of dimes throughout his whole life. So that Frank, at least the oldest boy, because they didn't have a lot of money being an immigrant family, would be able to go to college. He did so well that he ended up getting in on scholarship. And that was back when they gave full academic scholarships. It wasn't like a sports one or anything like that. So he went on full scholarship to MIT and he graduated Swope Fellow, which that is the total top of the class, and it was a great honor. He also, as part of that, they paid for his master's degree. So he got to continue and get his master's at MIT as well. So this is the original logo of, well, it's not the original. The original logo is a dog with the horn. And it was Victor Talking Machine when he started there. His very first job out of college was to replace the hand crank on the Victrola by creating an electronic motor, mechanical and electronic motor to make the record spin. While he was there through the whole time from when it was Victor Talking Machine to RCA Victor to then RCA. So what I wrote here is that this led to several other groundbreaking patents in sound, the beginning of a legacy, and a mark in history that forever changed many subtleties in life as we know it and take for granted today. And what I mean by that is some of the things that he worked on, and he was there through the Great Depression. RCA at the time was working on developing all kinds of different sound advancements, from speakers to microphones to everything. And one of the big things that they did was provide the sound for when motion pictures were going from silent films to talking pictures. Who can imagine going to a movie today and not hearing anything? I mean, it's just one of those things that we're so used to today, and nobody really thinks way back, although we all know it happened, but nobody knew who did it, who was responsible for that. And that was one of the things that he did. Do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, and marketing wasn't always his genius. He, when they started doing the idea of putting sound on film and having loudspeakers in the movie theaters, he thought, these people are crazy. People like to go to the movies so that they can watch and think. And if the people are talking, then it won't work. So he was absolutely convinced that he was on a dead-end path with this. But during the Depression, the first thing they did to save money was get rid of research, because that's next year's products you sell. We need to sell something today to survive to next year. The acoustics department was the only department that did not get severely cut or even shut down because of the movie theaters. There's so much went into that, because people could go to, for a dime, they could go to a triple feature and forget about their problems for a few hours. And so the movie theaters just ramped up tremendously.
Yep. This is a photograph of the research division at RCA Victor, and I can point the people out. This is Frank. This is Georgiana Galbraith, who became Frank's future wife, and my grandmother.
See, my father really did go for a sports scholarship.
Yeah.
He was in charge of the tennis team and the skating team, I guess. These are just some old photographs from when he was working at Victor talking machine and later RCA Victor. And this is some of the research back then. And the picture of the three here, the three individuals. This was his co-worker, the one in the middle, Harry Olson, who he wrote the first textbook on applied acoustics with. And the person on the end was Preston, John Preston. And he was head of their model shop that made all the goodies that they were trying to develop. And I'll give one little small story. You'll probably have to start kicking me soon.
Yeah, that's my other job.
When my father first went to work at Victor Talking Machine, there wasn't any, sound was a physics. It had nothing to do with engineering. When they made their Morning Glory horns, they did it by trial and error. They built a horn, and then built another one, and they play them, and they say, well, this one sounds better than that one, so we'll build this one. But it was pure accident which one was better. The head of the head of Victor Talking Machine was a gentleman named Johnson, and he was a blacksmith. And he invented a spring motor that would turn with constant torque for 3 minutes, so that you could get a half-decent sound out of it. And he decided he wanted to set up a research laboratory and started hiring some engineers to come in. When they came there, they didn't understand microphones or loudspeakers. Nobody did very well. But they were young electrical engineers. They understood electric circuits. So they developed the concept of creating a circuit equivalent circuit of the microphones and the loudspeakers, so that they could understand them and redesign them. And that became the engineering field of applied acoustics, which is what you need in order to be able to design them properly and manufacture them properly. And in 1934, Harry Olson, my father, wrote the first textbook on the field of applied acoustics.
And I have a couple things to add to that. Who recognizes the microphone in that picture? That's probably the most iconic model of a ribbon microphone ever. Harry Olson and my grandfather, Frank, patented that together. And that's one of the...
Became the trademark of NBC.
Yeah, it became the trademark for NBC. And if you look through old pictures, you'll see almost every major musical act, press conference, everybody's using that microphone. And what it did, because that microphone was designed so well, because engineering was applied to design it, it totally revolutionized how music was recorded and how it sounds. So that's like you used to have all these giant big bands because they needed the sound to go out, and people had to really belt out to sing. With the microphones, they didn't have to do that, so it allowed for a new style and more dynamics to come in and influence music. These are more old friends of his they worked with. Do you know?
I think Preston's there.
Yeah, Preston's one of them. And this is my grandfather with a motor on the right and a giant horn on the left. Some of the amazing designs that they did. A loudspeaker. What's the disc? The disc is
It was for measuring sound pressure.
for measuring sound pressure. So not only did they make the stuff that made the noise, they also measured it. This is my grandfather and grandmother when they got married. When Frank was at MIT, his two closest classmates that became his best friends for life were John Mealy and Harold Edgerton. And John Mealy was one of the most famous photographers of the time, shot pictures for Life magazine, and did a really famous one of Picasso where he left the shutter open, and Doc had made the strobe light so it allowed for him to paint with light. He took that photograph. He shot the photographs of their wedding. John Mealy.
Yeah, I want to make a couple of comments at the end before we go to the next thing. Were you through with what
Yes.
you? Oh, okay. We're gonna move quickly now. As soon as she takes the microphone away, we'll move quickly. But the time that he spent at RCA and later on up till 1945, I'm going to kind of run through kind of quickly. He started out in the research department, as we already said. But in the early 1930s, RCA started getting into doing more work with the Navy in the government, particularly the Navy. And they started to develop things like sound-powered telephones. They used to talk, the captain would talk to the engine room through a brass tube. He invented the sound-powered telephone that you could talk into a microphone. There's no electricity with it. The microphone would transmit the sound through wires to headphones, and one microphone could talk to 20 headphones. So they were able to have a lot better communication using the sound-powered telephone. And then they made battle-announced loudspeakers that would be able to withstand the pressure waves of 16-inch guns going off without breaking, so that the captain could talk to people on the deck. And because this business was getting starting to grow, because this business was starting to grow, I'm Italian, so I move my hands when I'm done. They decided they had to set up a separate division and have somebody who could work the transition from fast development and into production quickly, because they couldn't go through the normal process. And so they chose my father to be the one to be in charge of the government sound division. And when he started doing that, he would sit down with a large number of production engineers so that when they're deciding how are they going to build something, they would get into debates over, should the housing be a casting, or should it be a forging, or should it be a weldment? And they'd be going over all these pros and cons depending on what the volume was and how much different things would cost in different volumes. And he couldn't stand it because he thought, I'm wasting my time. And he wrote a letter to my grandmother saying, I'm wasting my time here. I want to design things, and they're sitting there spending a half an hour talking about should we make this thing out of a forging or a weldment. That's not important. What's important is, does it work? And she wrote back to him, and she was a very wise woman. And she she said to him, Frankie, you've had it easy all your life because everything came easy to you. Something is going on now that you don't understand as well, and you can't learn it as well, and you're shying away from it. It's important that you sit there and learn what's going on because it means it's important. So he stayed there, and he was at that position for 5 years. And he slowly started to understand what the importance of production engineering was. And he started to learn it. So that by the end of that time, he was a production engineer. He knew the answers before he asked the experts. And ever since then, from that whole time, the whole rest of his life, he always strongly said that the 5 years at that position were as important or not more important than the 5 years he spent at MIT. Because he recognized how you design it for production and how you get together the process to be able to build it for production is very important, because you could have the greatest design in the world, but if it costs too much or you couldn't build it with the specifications that you need with production workers, not high-trained technicians, it's useless. And that became the fundamental philosophy of what a development company needed to be. It needed to be a company that would do design work, strongly keeping production intent and production engineering as part of the efforts of going through the design operation and getting it to work.
So that was a core value that he totally brought when he eventually started his own. But before we get to that, he left RCA.
Well, no, I haven't gotten to that.
Okay, I want to make sure you do.
Yeah, before.
All right.
We have 3 hours, isn't that right? So what happened? So toward the end of the 1930s, the Government Sound Division was growing so large they decided to move it out to western Pennsylvania. And he thought, boy, he was an eastern boy. The Wild West started at the Hudson River. And if I have to go out to the Wild West, he got an offer from Brush Development Company in Cleveland to come and be their head of engineering. And he figured, well, if I'm going to go to the Wild West, I'll go to Cleveland instead of Western Pennsylvania. So he became director of engineering at production at Brush Development Company. And that was formed by Charles Brush died. And if you go to Cleveland and say, who invented the electric light? They'll say Charles Brush, because he had his arc lights in Cleveland before Edison had the incandescent lights in Manhattan. And when he died, he had a bunch of patents that he left, and his estate was trying to promote them. And they were using Rogel salt, which was a material for making transducers. And they were making phonograph pickups. And they're making $2 million a year of phonograph pickups. And it was very profitable. But they didn't have any real good engineering. So he became the head of engineering. The first thing he did was develop a loudspeaker using Rochelle salt instead of magnets. And they started talking to the car companies about it. At that time, World War II was heating up. It was going strong in Europe. We were supposedly neutral, but with a heavy bias. And we had formed a war production board with the understanding that war might be coming and we have to start preparing. And they started looking at critical materials. And and so one of the things they did was they said cobalt is a critical material. It can't be used for normal industrial aspects. It has to be stored for military use. That cut into magnet development in sales. And this non-magnetic speaker really looked good, and all the car companies wanted to buy them for their cars. Right at that time, a friend of his, who was the head of electronics for RCA, was called to active duty in the Navy. He was in the reserves. And he was in charge of the Brooklyn Gun Factory, which is where sonar was at the time. We didn't have a very good sonar situation at the beginning of World War II. And he called up and said, hey, we're trying to make a device to save ships that are out of convoy from being torpedoed by making these long lines of underwater sound pickups. And we want to be able to pick up a torpedo coming and then have TNT with each microphone. And when it got close, blow up the TNT and knock the torpedo out of the water. But we can't get it to work. So he said, well, send it to me, let me take a look. So he sent it to him, and the fellow looked at it, and what they did was they soundproofed it. They took they took a regular microphone, an air microphone, put it inside a hose with air all around it, and put it in the water. And the fundamentals of acoustics are that a microphone that works in air won't work well in water or vice versa. And so the sound when it hits air, it just 99% of it reflects back into the water. So nothing got into the air chamber. So he called his friend up and said, "Oh, I can redesign it so it will work." And he said, "Okay, fine." So he went to the head of the company and said, "Oh, look, I got this work from my friend with the Navy." And the president of the company said, "Frank, whatever you do, don't do any work for the Navy." He said, "Why shouldn't I do any work for the Navy?" He said, "Well, we're concerned. We're making all this great profit on our pickups, and everybody wants to buy your new loudspeaker. If you take a government job, though, if you don't succeed at it, they charge you all sorts of penalties, and you could ruin the business." So he felt a personal obligation, and so he came in over the weekend and built the unit himself, and put it in an envelope and mailed it to his friend. A couple of months later, the War Production Board cut out vacuum tubes. Without vacuum tubes, you don't have phonographs and you don't have radios, and Brush's business went to zero overnight. And they're about ready to close up. They're in the last week of business where they're just trying to figure out what are the severance pay we're going to give to everybody as we close the doors. When his friend called up and said, "Hey, we tried that thing he sent. It works beautifully. We were able to pick up torpedoes 1,000 yards away." And he negotiated a $10 million contract on the telephone. So he went back into the president and said, "Well, we have a choice. We can shut the doors today, or we can take a $10 million job from the Navy, and the worst situation would be we fail at it and we'll have to shut the doors 6 months from now. Which do you want to do?" So he took the job. He then was put onto a Navy board for sonar. And the head of the board was a gentleman named Admiral Fuhrer, which always seemed very strange to me. But he was sitting there. Now, he was in his mid-30s at the time. And everybody at that meeting had more gold around their clothes than you see at the Mint. And captains were coming in delivering coffee. So he felt a little bit intimidated. And they said, "Hey," the head of naval research got up and said, "Right now we make our transducers out of Rochelle salt plates that are 1 inch by 2 inches by 1/8 of an inch thick. We should make it mandatory that all new transducers will be designed with these plates, so that way we'll have a good constant supply of raw material." And so the admiral looked around and said, "Well, that sounds reasonable. Does anybody have any comments on it?" And my father sat there and thought, "My God, that's the craziest idea I ever heard." And he was looking around waiting for some of these more experienced people to say something, and nobody did. And so he finally said, "I have to say something." So he raised his hand, and the admiral said, "Yeah, what do you have to say?" And he said, "Well, I don't think that's a good idea." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "Well," and he figured, if I have to put it in terms that he'll understand. Because if I talk about how you design transducers, he's not going to know what I'm talking about. So he said, that would be like saying, we're going to want to be able to build all sorts of buildings and bridges of new construction ideas, but to make things better, everything has to be built with an I-beam, only one I-beam, which is 12 inches long and 6 inches wide. Do you think that would be a good idea? He said, "No." He said, "Well, that's exactly what you'd be doing to transducer designers if you did that." So he said, "Okay, I'm forming a subcommittee to advise how we should develop the sonars we're going to need in the war, and I'm making you head of the committee." So during World War II, suddenly Brush did only sonar work, and he had 12 engineers working for him. The Navy put $100,000 in the Cleveland Trust, and they gave him, he had a telephone conference connection with one guy who was his contact, and he would get orders over the telephone. We need something that does this, we need something that does that. There was no contracts. He did what he wanted, what they wanted to do, and he'd build them and they'd pay it.
And how does that work today?
That's not the way the government works now? I could swear by the last committee and subcommittee that I've heard a report on. Anyway, so that's how we went through the war. And during the 3.5 years of the war, they developed several hundred different transducers for wildly different applications. Not only that they had to design from scratch and put into production, but as soon as one thing would go out there, immediately the Germans would have countermeasures to it, and they'd have to redesign it to overcome the countermeasures. So everything that you developed, you had to redevelop 3 or 4 times, and they did all this in a 3.5-year period.
And for the submarines, that was literally sink or swim. But he took all of that, and with starting his own family and with doing all of this work and all of the knowledge they learned from everything from being the pioneer of electroacoustics with his team at RCA, everything he did with sonar at Brush, he took all of that and he decided, you know what, I'm gonna start out on my own. But he didn't start in Hingham. He started in Cleveland because that's where he was. So his first, it was called MASSA Laboratories at the time. And he started that, and it was primarily a consulting business. Through consulting, he raised the capital to eventually open up a shop which could have all of those elements they had learned throughout his working life, so that he could have a place where he could manufacture and produce. He could have a place where he could research and design, and it would all work together. And he would teach his group how to do that. So he started in Cleveland. He had some people working with him when he started there as well. Those people respected him so much, they followed him. He was looking, as he was growing, he had the money after negotiating. It was once a month, you say it. I'm going to screw it up.
In order to run his research company, he had 6 clients that paid him $1,000 a day for 1 day a month's work.
6 clients,
That was in 1945 dollars.
That's right.
And that's where he got the money to be able to hire 8 people.
And that's when so that group, some of them were family, some of them were the husbands, some were his brothers, some were the husbands of his siblings. But they all went with him when he was looking for a bigger facility, because he was from around here. He moved back he found a place in Hingham, which is the same spot where we are today that you all know.
Because he wanted to get into production.
Right.
And he didn't have a big enough place.
So he bought the building bought the land in Hingham, built the building there. And this is the permit. This is when they were starting to construct.
A lot less red tape to build things back then, too.
Yeah. Yeah, you buy some land, you want to build, you just do it. Get a crane, some people. And that is that's the very first building. And if you look closely on the sign, you can see MASSA Laboratories, Inc. Over the door. And it was much smaller then.
Yeah, we were only on Faulkner Road then.
Yeah. So this is Frank at work. On the right, that's an ultrasonic cleaning machine, and to the left, that's a test rack, right? No, test rack. Slide. So this is a little bit more. I want to talk about loyalty, family, and the Cleveland gang. On the right, there was a gentleman named Gilberto who was with us forever. I'm going to give the mic back to Dad in just a minute, but on the left, the gentleman wearing the tie and the white shirt, that was Jack Stoss, who was married to my grandfather's sister. So he went from Cleveland and worked at the plant as well. You want to talk about the things that they're building?
Yeah, well, the transducer there was a high-powered transducer that we developed back in the early 1960s, and the other shot is just an office, obviously.
Yes. But what are they doing in those papers? Do you know? I'm just kidding. So there's his first business card, and I love this poster because here he is. I mean, just think about how rapidly everything moved. You know, the idea that something can't be done was just not in our vocabulary, and it really isn't an answer we accept today either. So he's building and building. He just moved his whole family, his family's families. Everyone comes to Massachusetts. They build a whole building. They start out. They're doing business. Everything's going right. And he goes on a tour. He goes back to Cleveland. And the stuff that he's saying here, I love, because he wrote that the way it's advertised is that he's giving a brief, non-mathematical description on the properties of sound. And that ties back into understanding how to communicate something complex. And this is a quote of his. He actually said it to my dad. When he was a young engineer, he wrote this very complicated paper trying to impress his dad. And he looked at us and he goes, "Hey, I'm a busy man. I don't have time to read this." And he said, "If you can't explain engineering principles simply enough so the high school physics student can understand it, you don't know what the hell you're talking about." And he threw it at him. And but that's a really important message, and I try to teach my kids that too, because no matter what you do, you don't impress people by just talking with a bunch of fancy jargon. If you really care about what you're doing and you really want people to understand, you want them to understand. And you want to inspire people to learn and be on your team and do it too. And I think that that's a huge principle that allowed them to rapidly develop so many things by communicating to the right people quickly. So this is Frank and Georgiana and their 5 kids. My dad is the one on the right. Left. Your left, my right, sorry. He's on the right to his brother in the picture. So, well, that's semantics, isn't it? So these are articles that were in the paper about the expansion of the building. It says third expansion in 15 years, and we were looking at the chart, and what this really means is they counted as the first expansion when he left Cleveland. So this really, we didn't really build the building out 3 times. We did it twice. We built it once, and then we made it larger.
The first building was just this section here, which is now only the engineering department.
Yeah.
And then
we expanded. So this is just more engineering and manufacturing, sonars. That's my uncle Frankie, my dad's oldest brother. He was at the company for a very long time. Engineers doing some tests. All right, so this is our kind of timeline. So MASSA is MASSA, has always been MASSA. Our patents have always been MASSA. Our philosophy has always been MASSA, but we've had different periods of time that not everybody knows. So Cleveland was until 1950. We built the building in 1950, moved to Hingham. So the first business expansion was being able to have an actual facility, and that was in 1950. The first building expansion was in 1954. And what's exciting about that first building expansion, we're going to talk a little bit about more in the next few slides, because it goes right back into having to make sure that you're working efficiently and building things quickly, and impossible just is not a word that means anything. So MASSA division, Kogu Electronics, 1958 to 64. Second building expansion is 1960. DCA, which was MASSA division, we were still just MASSA, 1964 to 1973. And then MASSA Corporation. Now this is where things get interesting. MASSA Corporation was 1973 to 1978. There's a group that I don't think it's worth naming names, but it wasn't working well for my dad and my grandfather. So what they did is they said, okay, we're going to go off and take our patents, and we're going to go and do this on our own. And they kind of laughed at them because at the time, my grandfather was getting older. My dad was like a young kid, so it was like, oh yeah, haha, the old man and the young kid, they're going to go off and they're going to start a company now. Okay. Well, time goes by. The MASSA Corporation was starting to tank. So MASSA Products Corporation had an overlap, and we were doing well. So then we ended up going back and purchasing MASSA back, got the building back, moved back into the building, and sued them for patent infringement. And it's all history. So MASSA Products Corporation, back in Hingham to where we are now, was co-founded by my grandfather and my father. So this is Artemis. At MASSA, we do whatever it takes.
Artemis is the largest sonar transducer that has ever been built. And the Navy wanted to have, it produces 1 million watts of sound at a low frequency of 475 hertz. And the Navy didn't want to give the contract to a small company. We bid on it, and Bendix bid on it. They gave the contract to Bendix. We looked at Bendix's design and said, that's not going to work. Our design, we designed a electromagnetic transducer, which is, you'll see one downstairs, which is very rugged, very strong, and it can't be overdriven. So we figured there's going to be problems with what Bendix is doing. So we built a small array of what we were proposing, brought it down to the Navy to have them test it, just so they'd have a report of what it did. We did that all on our own. They took the Mission Capistrano, which was the ship, and they spent who knows how much putting a huge 2 amplifiers inside it. One was for the DC power, and the other was for the AC power. And they cut a hole through the bottom, and that right up here is the transducer. You can see the size of a person here, and that whole transducer would drop down through the center of the hole in the ship, and go as much as 1,200 feet down in the ocean. So they built that whole thing up, and they put Bendix's transducer in there. And when they did, it was like Chinese firecrackers. The transducer that had the lowest impedance would take most of the current. It would overdrive, and it blew up. The next one with the lowest impedance took all the power, and it blew up. It was pop, 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 pop. And in a couple of minutes, the entire array self-destructed. So they're sitting there with this whole major program, all the money invested in the vessel, and a transducer that just blew up in their face. And they picked up the report they had of our design and said, hey, this thing looks like it might work. So they showed up on our front step and said, geez, we're very interested in this transducer that you And we said, okay. And he said, okay, we need you to build it quickly for us for the Artemis program. And they said, but there's one hitch. We can't redesign the whole rig on the boat, So you have to redesign your transducer to fit into that mechanical structure. So we had to redesign the transducer, and they said they wanted to have it in a year's time. And so we said, okay, we'll do it, but we need a contract. This is the Navy now, right? They couldn't get a contract out quickly. They were working with Hudson's Laboratory at Columbia University at the time, giving them $20 million a year for doing theoretical work on low-frequency, high-power transducers and transmission. So they went to Hudson's Laboratory and said, look, buy the transducer from MASSA, we'll make it up later, because you have the money, we don't. So we actually sold it to Columbia University. So we started redesigning and rebuilding it. However, the building wasn't big enough to be able to build 1,440 of these 180-pound transducers. So we immediately started a rebuild of a larger building while we're starting to get into the production. And we did all that and shipped the thing within a year's time. And then, do you want to talk about the Squantum?
Yes, and in addition to doing all that within a year's time, we opened up another facility to handle continuous volume.
The receiving array, they asked us to do that. And the receiving array sat on towers, which were 80 feet long, tall, and they dropped it off of Bermuda into a 10-mile long array, 200 towers, to receive the sound. And the towers were too long to ship. So what we did was we rented an air hangar in Squantum that was right on the water. We built the hydrophones for it in Hingham, shipped them to Squantum, built the 80-foot long towers with the transducer on it. The Navy brought a barge up to the shore. We just put them on there and didn't have to ship it by Federal Express.
And this was the world's largest transducer ever built. Time magazine was impressed. And they picked up the sound all the way over in Australia.
Yeah, they're running it off of Bermuda.
And they picked it up in
The sound was
Australia.
picked up in Australia.
This is obviously something you could read if you tried, but what's important really with including these is that through this time we were getting a lot of...
Anniversary, they wrote that out.
Yeah, this was our 40th anniversary, and we love the title because this is like our motto. We lead by doing the impossible. Just because it hasn't been done before, and just because some well-known company couldn't do it, doesn't mean that we can't. And you just can't get ahead in the field or expand the field or expand the business if that's what you think. So you have to realize that when you have talented people, they'll be able to help you get to where you want to go. And if you've got the good ideas, it's worth exploring them. This is a fun slide because it has John Mealy, Doc, and my grandfather in it. It was the MIT Alumni Center.
Doc was on our board.
Yes, and Doc Edgerton was also on our board of directors and a close friend forever. This is my grandfather and Doc. What's sad to me is that I remember very clearly when my grandfather died, Doc came to the funeral and he went home that day afterwards and he died that night. Yeah. It's my dad, Gil, and my grandfather, and then my Aunt Georgie and my dad's Uncle Ernie in Germany for a MASSA trade show. My dad's Uncle Ernie was the vice president for MASSA for a long time and worked closely with his brother. And Georgie was what we call a flight attendant today, but she'd kill me if I said that. She prefers stewardess because that's what she was for Pan Am. So she spoke Italian, and but this was Germany. So I guess she was traveling over there because she was flying, but she stopped by the booth.
Got a layover.
A layover, yeah, okay. So as a family business, we know what's important. Food, of course, and family. So that's a picture of me with the carrots and the bread, and my grandfather with the bread. And we were, and that's my brother Drew as a baby that Georgie and grandfather are holding.
He's slightly bigger.
Yeah, he's bigger now, and he's also on our board of directors. Slide. This is just a collage of family with, my grandfather and I always had a joint birthday party because he was April 10th and I'm the 5th. So this was his 70th, right? So when he had his 70th birthday, they made a transducer cake. And everybody from the family came to the plant. It was just a lot of fun. And we still do a lot of family things like that at the plant today. So growing up within a family business, a business like ours is really an interesting one from the perspective of what we do as a family business. Most family businesses aren't, sonar manufacturers. They're not in a huge manufacturing plant in America today anymore. So, but we're involved as children with the business. I like to say my first business trip was when I was 4. I went to Taiwan. That's not in these pictures. But what is in these pictures is we dedicated a bunker at Northeastern to my grandfather. So I've got my brother and myself with our cousins and aunts and uncles all there for the dedication. And on the left is, or the right. You're. Right. I don't know right away. This one has Aunt Grace, Jack Stoss, and Uncle Ernie, and that was at our 60th anniversary. So MASSA as it is today, that's the building. So what is it we do in there? We have a lot of fun. We build stuff and we have fun. If we're not creative, if we're not laughing, we're not happy, and we don't do good work. So the idea is let's keep everybody happy. So this is a little bit what I was alluding to before, but I wanted to wait for the certificate. We're in the 12%, so we're actually in more of a minority than that. 12% just for third generation family business still being around. Being a manufacturer in America, that I don't know what percentage that actually brings us to, but I know it's a lot less. So the combination is quite an achievement in and of itself. So this is MASSA. This is our culture and our philosophy. We foster creativity and critical thinking in all aspects of the business. We're focused on innovation and production. We are designers, engineers, salespeople, marketers, managers, artists, problem solvers, and competent, talented people. Whatever our role, we love our role. We work together as a team to move the business forward. Opportunity is now here for each person to shine. We are not fearful, we are fearless. We push the limits of where electroacoustics can go, and sometimes it happens. Sometimes we may fail, but we always get up again, and that leads us to success. Our core capabilities are design, development, and production of electroacoustic technology and products. And we were shaped by our history, and we also shaped history, and that is a core value that will never leave MASSA. It's one of the most important things that sets us apart, and without it, I don't think that we'd be anywhere. So on this collage is one of my favorite collages because it has a little bit of from before we were MASSA that we spoke a lot about. The automatic bowling system is there, and a picture of a submarine with all of the sonars that we manufacture on it.
But what is an amazing thing to me, anyway, is that on the Virginia submarine, which is the most advanced submarine in the world today, we have more than 60% of the transducers on it that are on that boat are made by us. A little company in Hingham is making most of the sonar devices for the most advanced submarine in the world, and which is the main. You know, it's an amazing thought when you think about it, and it's.
And our goal is to keep that going. But you know, we do more than the sonar. The sonar is huge. It's very important. We are very proud of it and want to continue it. But we're just as excited about all of the other projects and products that we do commercially. And you know, I was asked what B2B is. It's business to business. We do a lot of sensors for from our business to other businesses to use, and then they sell contraptions that are taking care of sensing things. So that's B2B. So our mission and our vision are really important to us. You know, we want to contribute to the world by exceeding customer needs through the innovation in electroacoustic technologies and the manufacturing of sonar and ultrasonic systems. And you know, our vision is to continue to be the leader of electroacoustic innovation, invention, and production. We invest in our people, we support our community. We're really happy to be here today. And we partner with people. This is one of the companies that we're co-branding with, that we have a product launched. They're at Kingspan, they're in Northern Ireland, and they manufacture tanks. And they want to sell sensors as part of their tanks. And they tried a whole bunch of sensors. Didn't like any of them. We worked with them about what they were looking for, developed something, and we co-brand it, so they're selling it as part of their outfit. So this is what we do. You know, we're growing in what we know, how we build. We have so many wonderful new projects, both commercial and military contracts and sales at this present time. Each generation adds a little bit of ourselves to the business, and that's really important because that's how we're able to continue to grow. And, you know, we continue to push the envelope of what's possible and set new standards for what is possible within the field of electroacoustics. Thank you.